"We'd prefer if you didn't talk too much tonight, Mom." Simone's parents, they have certain expectations. The words were polite on the surface, but they cut deep, like a whisper meant to erase someone's worth. My name is Margaret Lane, 59 years old. For more than 3 decades, I worked as a logistics executive managing contracts that moved goods across oceans. I retired early quietly, without a farewell party or headlines. I've always lived modestly. The same apartment, the same leather purse, the same rhythm of life. To my son David, that modesty looked like limitation. To me, it was peace. He married Simone 3 years ago. Sharp, elegant, confident. She never said it aloud, but her eyes did. Your mother doesn't belong in our world. So when David invited me to dinner with Simone's parents, I knew what it really was. Not an invitation, a test. He wanted me to look presentable but invisible. Pleasant but silent, graceful yet small. I smiled on the phone and said, "Of course, darling." Because sometimes the best way to reveal truth is to let people show it themselves. That evening, I opened my wardrobe. Silk blouses, pressed suits, untouched for years. I skipped them. Instead, I chose a simple navy dress, slightly faded, and my old pearl earrings. I didn't need armor. I already had something stronger. Dignity. If you've ever been underestimated because of how you live or how simply you dress, stay with me till the end of this story. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far dignity travels. And if you believe that respect doesn't come from money or titles, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next family story that speaks straight to the heart. I arrived early at the restaurant. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, quiet piano music, and the kind of place where the lighting itself seems to judge you. David was already there, adjusting his tie, his eyes flickering toward the door every few seconds. Simone sat beside him, flawless in a silver dress, scrolling through her phone. When they saw me, Simone's smile was thin, like a blade wrapped in velvet. Her mother turned slightly, scanning me from shoes to hair, then whispered something to her husband. He chuckled. I walked toward them calmly, step by step, hearing the echo of my heels against marble. I greeted them warmly, pulled out my own chair, and sat down without waiting for help. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was revealing. And I realized something. Tonight wasn't about me proving anything. It was about them discovering who I truly was. Not through words, not through wealth, but through grace. Because sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is quiet composure. And before that dinner ended, they would learn exactly what that means. The waiter approached our table, his posture perfect, his voice polite. "Good evening. Would you like to start with drinks?" Before I could open my mouth, Simone spoke quickly. "We'll have a bottle of the Chateau Margaux, please. And just water for her." She didn't even look at me when she said it. Her. A faint smile crossed my lips. I nodded to the waiter. "Water is fine." "Thank you." David shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. His parents-in-law, however, seemed delighted with their daughter's decisiveness. Her father, Franklin, a man with a sharp nose and sharper tone, leaned back and said, "Simone knows her wine. We've always taught her that good taste defines good breeding." I simply smiled and folded the napkin over my lap. Good breeding. The phrase lingered in my mind like a perfume that had turned sour. The waiter poured the wine carefully into crystal glasses. I watched as Simone's mother, Veronica, lifted hers gracefully. "To family," she said, clinking glasses with her husband and daughter. David hesitated, then joined them. No one raised a glass toward me. I sipped my water slowly. It tasted purer than anything else on that table. Simone turned to her mother, her tone sweet but measured. "Mom, you'll love the house design. It's coming along beautifully. We're hoping to move in before summer." "Oh, darling, that's wonderful," Veronica replied. "And of course, Franklin will help with the final touches. After all, our family has an eye for quality." Her gaze slid toward me, the corners of her lips tightening. "David told us you live in the suburbs, Mrs. Lane?" "Yes," I replied softly. "A small apartment, but it's home." Veronica nodded slowly, feigning sympathy. "How lovely. Simple living keeps the mind humble, doesn't it?" Her husband chuckled. "Humility is good, but one should never confuse it with mediocrity." Simone laughed, a light, careful laugh, then reached to fix a strand of her mother's hair. David said nothing. Inside, I felt something stir. Not anger, not hurt, just a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I needed to be. Every word they spoke told me more about them than I could ever ask, and still I kept smiling. The main course arrived, a delicate arrangement of tiny portions with names longer than the plate itself. Veronica described each dish as though she'd invented it. Franklin nodded in approval at every bite. When the waiter placed mine down, he whispered, "Enjoy, ma'am." I looked up at him and smiled. That small act of respect, ma'am, felt like a reminder some people still see. Halfway through dinner, Franklin turned his attention to me again. "So, Mrs. Lane, David tells us you're retired. That must be liberating." "Yes," I said calmly. "It's given me time to focus on things that matter." He tilted his head. "And what would those be?" I met his gaze. "So, peace, gratitude, watching others reveal who they truly are." The table fell silent for a moment. Veronica forced a smile. "How poetic." Simone quickly changed the topic, her voice just a little too bright. "We've been thinking about helping Mom and Dad renovate their villa in Italy. It's such a beautiful place, but it needs an update." "Oh yes," Veronica added. "We're even considering adding a guest wing, maybe for when family visits." The word family rolled off her tongue with the weight of irony. I placed my fork down gently. "How wonderful," I said. "A place where everyone can feel welcome." David's eyes met mine for the first time that evening, and for a second, I saw the boy he once was, ashamed, confused, unsure which side to stand on. As the plates were cleared, I leaned back in my chair, observing the golden light reflecting off the glasses. They had spent the entire evening polishing their image, layer after layer, unaware that every reflection made their arrogance clearer. Veronica smiled sweetly. "Mrs. Lane, you've been so quiet." "You must tell us something about yourself." I folded my hands neatly. "There's not much to tell. I've lived a simple life. I've worked hard, saved carefully, and tried to teach my son that respect is worth more than wealth." Her eyes glimmered with something close to amusement. "Ah, values. Such an old-fashioned concept, isn't it, Simone?" Simone laughed softly. "Yes, but charming." I smiled back. "Old-fashioned things tend to last longer." The words hung in the air, calm and sharp at the same time. Veronica looked away. Simone adjusted her napkin. Franklin cleared his throat. I picked up my glass of water and took another sip. The evening wasn't over yet, and the lesson they were about to learn hadn't even begun. The waiter returned with dessert menus, but no one touched them. The air at the table had changed. Thin, cold, almost metallic. Veronica dabbed the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin, pretending politeness. "So, Mrs. Lane," she said smoothly, "tell me, how do you spend your days now that you're retired?" "Some women feel rather lost without work." Her tone was sweet, but her words carried small, invisible blades. I looked up and met her eyes. "I'm far from lost," I said softly. "I finally have time to think, to read, to observe." Simone shifted uncomfortably beside her mother. "Mom just means it must be an adjustment." I smiled. "Everything is an adjustment, dear, even good manners." The silence that followed was brief but sharp. Franklin cleared his throat, trying to lighten the mood. "So, Mrs. Lane, David tells us you never traveled much. You should let them take you to Europe sometime, see what real culture looks like." My hand stayed folded on my lap. "Culture isn't a destination, Mr. Thompson." "It's a behavior." He blinked, unsure how to respond. Simone's eyes widened slightly, caught between admiration and alarm. I wasn't trying to wound them, but there are moments when silence alone is no longer strength. It must be accompanied by truth, calm and unshakable. The waiter appeared again. "Would anyone like dessert?" Veronica smiled tightly. "Wait, just coffee for us, simple things." Then turning to me, "Perhaps you'd prefer tea, Mrs. Lane? It's easier on older stomachs." Her tone was honeyed cruelty. I nodded politely. "Tea will be perfect. I've found it helps one digest arrogance quite well." Simone inhaled sharply. David's fork clinked against his plate. Veronica's expression froze. Perfect porcelain, no cracks, just a faint tremor around her lips. I leaned back, not triumphant, not smug, simply composed. Because people like her weren't my enemies. They were mirrors, showing me what I'd chosen not to become. The coffee came. The waiter placed my teacup gently before me. "Thank you," I said with warmth. He smiled. "Not my pleasure, ma'am." That simple acknowledgement felt more genuine than everything else that evening combined. Veronica stirred her cup mechanically. Franklin checked his watch. Simone kept folding and unfolding her napkin. I decided to end the tension, not by retreating, but by offering something they couldn't understand: grace. "I must thank you," I said quietly, "for inviting me. It's good for me to be reminded of certain things." Veronica tilted her head. "Such as?" "That silence is sometimes mistaken for weakness, and humility for insignificance. But both have a way of revealing character. Not mine, but others." Her eyes darted toward David. "Your mother has quite the philosophical view, doesn't she?" He didn't answer. He looked down, ashamed. And in that moment, I knew my son saw everything: the performance, the condescension, the invisible weight of comparison. He saw it, and it broke something in him. When the bill arrived, Franklin reached for it. "Please allow me," he said. "It's our treat." I smiled gently. "Thank you, but I insist." I took out my old wallet, the same one I'd carried for 20 years, and slid a platinum card across the table. Veronica froze. Franklin blinked. Simone's hand stilled midair. David whispered, "Mom." "Yes, darling." He stared at the card. "You never told me you had—" "There was never a reason to," I said. "True wealth isn't meant to be displayed." The waiter returned moments later. "Everything's settled, ma'am." "Have a wonderful evening." Veronica's smile faltered, then crumbled. She leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Lane, I must admit I didn't expect—" "That's the thing about expectations," I said gently. "They tell more about the person who holds them than the one they're aimed at." Franklin exhaled heavily. Simone looked away. David sat in silence, eyes moist, realizing what he'd allowed. I reached for my coat slowly, my every movement calm, deliberate, soundless. "I should go," I said. "It's been enlightening." No one stopped me. No one could. As I walked out of that glittering restaurant, the music followed. A quiet piano melody, soft and distant. The air outside was crisp, the night calm. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel vindicated. What I felt was clarity. Because sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It simply stands, pays the bill, and leaves everyone else sitting in their silence. And behind that silence, shame begins to bloom. Outside, the wind was cold and crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. I stood by the curb, waiting for a cab. Behind me, the laughter from the restaurant drifted through the glass. Forced, hollow, desperate. I didn't turn back. When the taxi stopped, I got in quietly. The driver, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, glanced at me through the mirror. "Rough night, ma'am?" I smiled faintly. "Not rough. Just revealing," he chuckled. "Those are the ones that stay with us the longest." As the city lights slid across the window, I thought about David, the way his eyes avoided mine, the tremor in his voice when he called me Mom. He had let them belittle me, not out of cruelty, but out of fear of losing approval, of being seen as less. I remembered when he was small how he used to say, "Mom, one day I'll buy you something big, a house, maybe a car." And I always told him, "Son, just give me respect, and that's worth more than any of it." Now I knew how little that lesson had settled. When I reached home, I placed my purse on the counter and sat in the dark for a long while. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full of answers. Every cruel smile, every word dipped in politeness, every glance of pity had revealed what I needed to know. I didn't hate Simone or her parents. I pitied them. Because people who need to prove their worth with wine labels and designer chairs are never truly at peace. I brewed a cup of tea and looked out the window. Across the street, my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Hayes, was bringing in her laundry in the drizzle. I went over to help her, laughing softly when she scolded me for being out in the cold. "Margaret, you're too kind," she said. "Kindness doesn't expire with age," I answered. When I returned inside, my phone vibrated, a message from David. "Mom, are you home?" "I'm sorry for tonight. Can I come by tomorrow?" I stared at the screen, the words blurring for a moment, then I typed back, "Of course, darling. I'll make breakfast." The next morning he arrived early, still in his suit from the night before. He looked tired, older somehow. I poured him coffee. He didn't touch it. "Mom," he began, "I didn't know. About the card, about any of it." "You weren't supposed to," I said gently. "You don't owe me admiration, David." Just respect, he rubbed his temples. Simone's parents, they were wrong. And I should have said something. I reached for his hand. You said enough by staying silent when it mattered most. Silence can wound, but it can also teach. What matters is what you do with the lesson. He looked at me, eyes red. I don't want you to think I'm ashamed of you. I smiled softly. You were never ashamed of me, David. You were ashamed of yourself for thinking I wasn't enough. He nodded, tears glinting. I'll fix this. There's nothing to fix, I said. Just grow. That's all any mother wants. We sat quietly sipping coffee. The morning sun spilled into the room. Soft, forgiving, golden. Later that day, Simone came by. Her confidence had wilted. She held a small bouquet of lilies. Mrs. Lane, she began, I owe you an apology. I nodded for her to sit. Apologies are only meaningful when they come with understanding. She hesitated, then whispered, I thought you were just less? I finished for her. She looked down. Yes, I didn't let her drown in guilt. I placed a hand on hers. That's because you measure worth in ways that vanish. But life has a way of showing us the real currency. Kindness, integrity, composure. Learn that, and you'll never feel poor again. She exhaled shakily, tears threatening. You're kinder than I deserve. No, I said quietly, just older than your mistakes. As she left, she turned at the door. For what it's worth, I hope one day I can carry myself the way you did last night. When the door closed, the house felt still again, but not empty, peaceful. I looked around at my small apartment and the books stacked neatly, the framed photo of David as a boy, the clock ticking softly on the wall. Nothing glittered here, yet everything shone, because peace, once earned, needs no witnesses. That night, I sat by the window again, watching the rain trace silver lines down the glass. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang, slow and gentle. I thought about the restaurant, the chandeliers, the sharp perfume, the empty laughter, and then I smiled. Some people chase luxury to feel seen. Others choose dignity and glow quietly in the dark. For the first time in a long while, I felt completely at ease. Not because I'd proven them wrong, but because I no longer needed to. Sometimes victory doesn't sound like applause. It sounds like peace. The days after that dinner passed quietly, like ripples settling after a storm. David came by often, sometimes to check in, sometimes just to sit with me. There was no more awkward small talk, no strained politeness. He seemed lighter, humbled, more aware. But I didn't need apologies anymore. I had already forgiven him the moment I saw understanding in his eyes. Simone, too, began to change. It started with small gestures, texts asking about my health, a basket of fruit left by my door, then timid visits where she'd sit across from me, folding and unfolding her hands. The arrogance had faded. What remained was uncertainty, and beneath it, a quiet wish to start again. One afternoon, she knocked softly on my door. "Come in, dear," I said. She stepped inside holding a small box. "I brought you something," she murmured. Inside was a delicate silver brooch shaped like a lily. Simple, elegant, nothing like the lavish things she used to flaunt. "It belonged to my grandmother," she said. "She taught me that elegance isn't about being noticed, it's about being remembered." I looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "Then I'll treasure it." She hesitated before sitting down. "I've been thinking about that night," she said quietly. "I realized how much of myself I saw in my mother. The need to impress, to look perfect, to win every unspoken contest." She took a breath. "And I hated it. I became her without even noticing." I reached for her hand. "We all become what we're surrounded by until someone holds up a mirror." Her eyes glistened. "That night you were that mirror." The words lingered in the air, soft and true. I didn't need to say anything more. Sometimes silence is the kindest way to let someone find their own peace. When she left that day, I pinned the silver brooch to my navy coat, not as decoration, but as a reminder that growth often begins in discomfort. Weeks passed. Life slipped back into its rhythm, simple, steady, graceful. I spent mornings reading on the balcony, afternoons tending to the small garden behind the building. Neighbors would stop by for tea, and sometimes Simone joined us, bringing homemade pastries that always came out slightly crooked but full of effort. She started calling me Mom, not out of obligation, but affection. One evening, she and David invited me to their new house, a quiet place on the edge of town surrounded by blooming magnolias. It was modern but warm, filled with sunlight and laughter that didn't feel forced. When I arrived, Simone greeted me at the door with an apron still tied around her waist. "I made dinner," she said, cheeks flushed. "Don't expect much. It's edible, I think." I laughed softly. "If it's made with sincerity, it'll be perfect." The table was simple: white candles, ceramic plates, a small vase of fresh flowers. David poured water into my glass before serving himself, an old gesture of respect he hadn't shown in years. Halfway through dinner, Simone set down her fork. "There's something I want to tell you," she said. "We decided to name the new foundation after you." I blinked. "Foundation?" David smiled. "We're funding scholarships for young women who don't have family support but dream big, just like you did. It'll be called the Margaret Lane Fund." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, my eyes filled. Not because of the name, but because of what it meant. They understood. They had learned the true measure of worth. I reached across the table and touched Simone's hand. "You don't owe me anything," I whispered. She shook her head. "We know. That's why it feels right." After dinner, I stepped outside. The air smelled of magnolias and rain. The same quiet calm from that night at the restaurant washed over me, but this time it wasn't lonely. It was peace, shared and alive. David joined me on the porch, hands in his pockets. "You were right, Mom," he said softly. "About what?" "That respect lasts longer than approval." I smiled. "You had to see both sides to know the difference." We stood there for a long while, watching the garden lights flicker under the rain. Later, as I walked home, I passed the old restaurant, the same one where it all began. Through the window, another family sat at the same corner table. The mother looked nervous, the younger woman distracted by her phone, the father glancing at the bill. It was a mirror of the past, replaying in different faces. But I didn't feel bitterness. I felt gratitude. Because life, in its quiet way, always gives us chances to rewrite our stories, not by changing others, but by becoming the example they eventually follow. When I got home, I placed the silver brooch on the mantel beside my favorite photograph of David as a child. The petals glimmered softly in the lamplight. I whispered to myself, not revenge, not pride, just dignity. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something even greater than triumph. A serene joy that comes only from knowing you've taught without preaching, healed without demanding, and forgiven without being asked. The next morning, I woke early. The city was quiet, painted in pale gold. I poured tea, opened the window, and let the air fill the room. Peace didn't look like luxury. It looked like sunlight on old wood, a familiar chair, a life lived truthfully. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't changing how others see you. It's changing how they see themselves because of you. Sunday morning arrived softly. Sunlight filtering through my curtains, the sound of church bells distant but comforting. I brewed my usual black coffee and sat by the window, watching life unfold below. A mother walking her child to the park, an old man reading a newspaper on a bench, a young couple laughing over breakfast at the cafe across the street. Ordinary things, real things. I thought about how much had changed in such a short time. Not around me, but within me. That dinner had once been a wound, but now it felt like a door that had finally closed so peace could enter. My world hadn't grown bigger. It had grown quieter, clearer, and infinitely richer. A message blinked on my phone. It was Simone. "Good morning, Mom. We're visiting the foundation site today. We wanted to take you with us," I smiled. I typed back, "I'll be there soon." As I got ready, I passed the mirror. The same reflection, the same wrinkles, the same calm eyes. But the woman looking back was no longer pretending to be less than she was. She had nothing left to prove. At the foundation site, volunteers were painting the walls of what would soon become a community learning center. Simone was directing the team, her hair tied back, her shoes muddy. David was lifting boxes, his shirt rolled up, smiling in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. When Simone saw me, she ran over, hugging me tightly. "This is for you," she said, "because your story changed ours." I looked around, young women laughing, working, dreaming, and felt tears warm my eyes. "No," I said softly, "this is for them. For everyone who's ever been judged by appearances, for everyone who stayed silent to protect their dignity, for everyone who chose grace when the world expected anger." Simone nodded, her eyes shining. "Just, you were right that night, Mom. Money doesn't buy class, but humility does. We stood together in the morning sun, surrounded by paint, laughter, and new beginnings. And in that moment, I finally understood. True victory doesn't come from revenge or pride. It comes from living so gracefully that those who doubted you are forced to learn from you. Because sometimes silence teaches louder than shouting. Sometimes forgiveness humiliates more deeply than fury." I took a breath, looked up at the clear blue sky, and felt something deep and quiet settle inside me. Not triumph, not regret, but peace. If you've ever been misunderstood or judged for living simply, remember this: dignity never needs to announce itself. It shines quietly, it lasts. I've learned that you don't have to raise your voice to make an impact. You don't have to prove your worth to anyone who measures life in price tags. You just have to keep walking with grace, because in time, the world notices. And maybe someone out there watching this story needs that reminder tonight that kindness isn't weakness and silence isn't surrender. Sometimes both are strength in disguise. If this story touched your heart, take a quiet moment to share where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe, like I do, that grace always wins in the end, I'd love for you to stay with me here. Subscribe for more family stories about love, dignity, and quiet strength. Stories that remind us what truly matters when the noise fades away. Because in the end, that's all that remains. Not the gold, not the praise, not the judgment, only the peace of knowing you lived with truth.